Trump Plaza Hotel and Casino was the crown jewel of Donald Trump's entertainment empire, and on a cold January night, the ballroom was filled with some of the biggest names in the music industry for a charity event benefiting Parents Anonymous. Among the performers scheduled that evening was a 25-year-old singer who had already conquered the music world with a voice that critics were calling the greatest of her generation. Whitney Houston stood backstage in a white gown that caught the stage lights like captured starlight, preparing to perform for an audience that included her mother Cissy Houston, fellow singer Cheryl, Pepsi Riley, and the man who owned the building they were standing in. Donald Trump had made it a point to attend the event personally, not just as the property owner, but as someone who genuinely appreciated great talent when he saw it. He had heard Whitney's records, had watched her meteoric rise, but he had never heard her perform live. That was about to change in a way that would stay with him for the rest of his life. When Whitney Houston walked onto that stage and opened her mouth to sing, something extraordinary happened in that ballroom. The conversations stopped. The clinking of glasses ceased. Every person in that room, from the wealthiest casino high rollers to the servers carrying champagne trays, froze in place as that voice filled the space with a power and beauty that seemed almost supernatural. Donald Trump, who had spent decades around entertainers and had developed a somewhat cynical view of the industry's manufactured stars, found himself genuinely moved in a way that caught him off guard. This wasn't just technical skill or professional polish. This was something rare and precious, a gift that came along maybe once in a generation if you were lucky. After the performance, Trump made his way backstage to meet Whitney and her family. The meeting was brief but warm, with Trump expressing his genuine admiration for her talent and Whitney graciously thanking him for hosting the event at his property. Over the next several years, Whitney Houston performed at Trump's Atlantic City properties multiple times. Each performance reinforced Trump's conviction that he was witnessing something historic, a talent that would define an era and influence countless artists who came after. Trump made it a point to attend these performances whenever his schedule allowed, and a professional friendship developed between the real estate mogul and the music superstar. They weren't close friends in the traditional sense. They didn't vacation together or call each other regularly. But there was a mutual respect and genuine fondness that went beyond typical business relationships. Trump saw in Whitney someone who shared his commitment to excellence and his understanding of what it took to reach the absolute top of your field. Whitney, for her part, appreciated that Trump treated her as a serious artist rather than just a pretty face with a good voice, something she encountered far too often in an industry that sometimes struggled to take Black women seriously as complete artists. But even during these golden years, Trump noticed things that concerned him. Whitney was always professional during her Trump Plaza performances, but there were moments that hinted at vulnerabilities beneath the polished surface. She seemed to carry an enormous weight of expectation, not just from her record label and her fans, but from her family and the Black community that saw her as a trailblazer opening doors for those who would follow. Trump, who understood the burden of carrying a famous family name and living up to impossible expectations, recognized the toll this was taking even when Whitney was at her absolute peak. There were also warning signs in Whitney's choice of companions and romantic partners. Trump had heard rumors about her tumultuous relationship with Bobby Brown, the bad boy R&B singer whose reputation for wild behavior and substance abuse was well known throughout the industry. When Whitney married Bobby in 1992, Trump was among the guests at that purple-themed wedding, and he left the celebration deeply concerned about what he had witnessed. The 1990s progressed, and the warning signs that Trump and others had noticed became impossible to ignore. Whitney's behavior became increasingly erratic. Performances that should have been triumphant became painful to watch as her once flawless voice showed signs of damage from substance abuse. The tabloids, which had once celebrated her as America's princess, now documented every stumble, every bizarre public appearance, every piece of evidence that something was terribly wrong. Trump, who had moved on from Atlantic City to focus on his Manhattan properties and his reality television career, followed Whitney's decline from a distance with increasing alarm. He hadn't been close enough to Whitney to feel comfortable reaching out directly, but he heard stories through mutual acquaintances in the entertainment industry that troubled him deeply. Whitney was using drugs. Her marriage to Bobby Brown had descended into a toxic cycle of fights and reconciliations. The people around her were enabling her worst impulses rather than protecting her talent and her well-being. By the early 2000s, Whitney Houston was in freefall. Her physical appearance had changed dramatically, her trademark beauty ravaged by years of cocaine and other drug use. Her voice, that incredible instrument that Trump had considered the greatest he had ever heard, was a shadow of its former glory. Performances became increasingly rare, as Whitney's unreliability made her uninsurable and unbookable at major venues. The music industry, which had built her up and profited enormously from her talent, now seemed content to watch her destroy herself, while occasionally offering thoughts and prayers, but little concrete help. Trump watched this destruction play out in the tabloids and entertainment news programs with a mixture of sadness and frustration. He had seen this pattern before in Atlantic City, where talented performers with addiction issues slowly destroyed themselves while everyone around them enabled their behavior or looked the other way. He had watched his own brother, Fred Trump Jr., die from alcoholism, a tragedy that had shaped Trump's decision never to drink and his sensitivity to recognizing addiction's warning signs in others. Sometime in the early 2000s, the exact year remains unclear even after Mike Love's revelation, Donald Trump decided he couldn't simply watch Whitney Houston destroy herself without at least trying to help. Trump wasn't a counselor or an addiction specialist, but he was someone who knew how to assemble teams of experts and coordinate complex operations. More importantly, he genuinely cared about what happened to Whitney, not because of any business interest or desire for publicity, but because he had watched her extraordinary talent and believed that someone that gifted deserved better than to die in a drug-induced haze. Trump began making discreet inquiries through his network of contacts in entertainment and business. He wanted to know who in Whitney's life might be willing to participate in an intervention, who among her friends and family was genuinely trying to help rather than simply enabling. The picture that emerged from these inquiries was deeply troubling. Whitney had become isolated from many of the people who truly cared about her well-being. Her mother, Sissy, was largely shut out of her life, having been deemed too judgmental and controlling by Whitney's enablers. Clive Davis, the legendary producer who had discovered Whitney and guided her career to unprecedented heights, had limited influence over her personal choices. Trump decided that if he was going to attempt an intervention, it would need to be done at a location where Whitney felt comfortable and safe, with people who had both the resources to provide real help and the credibility to be taken seriously. He settled on Mar-a-Lago, his Palm Beach estate that served as both his winter home and an exclusive club for wealthy and powerful members. Mar-a-Lago was private enough that an intervention could be conducted away from media scrutiny, but impressive enough that Whitney would understand the seriousness of the effort being made on her behalf. Trump then began assembling the team that would participate in the intervention. He reached out to Ron Perelman, the billionaire businessman who had his own history with addiction through family members and who had funded numerous treatment programs and research initiatives. He also contacted Mike Love of the Beach Boys, a musician who had witnessed countless friends and colleagues destroy themselves with drugs and alcohol over his decades in the music industry. The team that Trump assembled wasn't random. Each person brought specific expertise or credibility that might help break through Whitney's defenses and denial. The exact details of how Whitney Houston came to be at Mar-a-Lago for the intervention remain somewhat murky, even after Mike Love's public revelation. What is known is that Trump used his connections and influence to arrange for Whitney to visit Palm Beach under circumstances that wouldn't immediately trigger her suspicion that an intervention was being planned. The invitation may have been framed as a social visit or a low-key business discussion about potential future performances. Whatever the pretext, Whitney arrived at Mar-a-Lago unaware that Trump had assembled a group of people specifically to confront her about her drug use and convince her to enter treatment. The setting itself was calculated to impress and to signal the gravity of the situation. Mar-a-Lago was Trump's masterpiece, a 126-room mansion that had once belonged to serial heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post, and which Trump had transformed into what he called the Winter White House long before he actually became president. The estate's opulence and history were meant to communicate that this wasn't a casual conversation, but a serious attempt by serious people to save her life. Ron Perelman arrived at Mar-a-Lago, understanding the delicate nature of the mission. As the chairman and CEO of Mac Andrews and Forbes Incorporated, and a man worth billions, Perelman's presence signaled that this intervention had the backing of people with real resources and connections. Perelman had dealt with addiction in his own family and had become passionate about funding treatment research and programs. His involvement in Whitney's intervention wasn't just symbolic. He had the ability to arrange for the best treatment facilities, the most qualified addiction specialists, and the kind of comprehensive care program that could actually give Whitney a chance at recovery. Mike Love's presence brought a different kind of credibility. As a founding member of the Beach Boys and someone who had survived decades in the music industry, Love had witnessed the dark side of fame more times than he could count. He had seen Brian Wilson's mental health struggles, had watched countless contemporaries destroy themselves with drugs and alcohol, and had lived through the evolution of rock and roll culture from innocent surf music to drug-fueled excess. His perspective as a fellow musician might reach Whitney in ways that businessmen like Trump and Perelman could not. When Whitney Houston realized that she had been brought to Mar-a-Lago for an intervention rather than a social visit, her initial reaction was defensive and angry. This was a pattern common to most interventions. The person struggling with addiction feels ambushed and betrayed by the people claiming to help them. Whitney had been through this before with her mother and other family members, and she had developed sophisticated defense mechanisms and rationalizations for her drug use. She insisted that she had her addiction under control, that she could quit whenever she wanted, that everyone was overreacting to isolated incidents blown out of proportion by a media that had always been waiting for her to fail. Trump, Perelman, and Love listened to these denials, and excuses with the patient understanding of people who had heard similar stories many times before. They had prepared for this resistance, and had agreed in advance on their strategy for breaking through Whitney's defenses. The key was to focus not on judgment or shame, but on the cold facts of what was happening to her career, her health, and her legacy. Donald Trump took the lead in much of the intervention, and those who were there later described his approach as surprisingly gentle given his reputation for aggressive business tactics and blunt communication. Trump spoke to Whitney about the first time he had heard her sing at Trump Plaza in 1989, about how that voice had moved him in ways that very few things in his life had. He talked about watching her career soar to heights that seemed impossible, about how proud he had been to host her performances and to count her as someone he knew and admired. Then Trump shifted to the painful present, describing what it was like to see recent footage of her performing, to watch that incredible voice struggle with notes that should have been effortless, to see her physical beauty ravaged by drugs. Trump didn't mince words about what was happening. Whitney was destroying the gift that had made her one of the greatest singers in history, and if she didn't stop immediately, she would die. It wasn't a question of if but when. The trajectory she was on had only one possible ending, and Trump couldn't stand by and watch that happen without at least trying to change the outcome. Ron Perelman followed Trump's emotional appeal with a more practical proposition. Perelman explained that he was prepared to arrange for Whitney to receive treatment at the best addiction facility in the world, a place that specialized in treating high-profile individuals whose careers and reputations were at stake. This wouldn't be a typical 28-day rehab stint followed by outpatient meetings. Perelman was offering to fund a comprehensive treatment program that could last months if necessary, with the best addiction medicine specialists, therapists who specialized in trauma and the unique psychological pressures of fame, and a staff who understood how to treat someone at Whitney's level of addiction severity. The financial cost would be irrelevant. Perelman would cover everything without any expectation of repayment. More than that, Perelman offered to help restructure Whitney's professional and personal life to support her recovery. This might mean temporarily stepping away from performing, cutting ties with toxic relationships, including possibly her marriage to Bobby Brown, and building a new team of managers and advisors whose primary loyalty was to Whitney's well-being rather than to the money she could generate. Mike Love added the musician's perspective to the intervention, speaking to Whitney artist to artist about what it meant to survive in an industry that chewed people up and spit them out. Love talked about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys' own struggles with drugs and mental health, about friends he had lost to addiction over his long career, about the specific ways that fame and creative pressure could drive talented people to seek escape through substances. Love's message was that Whitney's struggle wasn't a sign of weakness or moral failure, but rather a predictable consequence of the impossible pressures placed on someone with her level of talent and visibility. But understanding why she had turned to drugs didn't change the fact that continuing to use them would kill her, probably sooner rather than later. Love emphasized that Whitney still had time to save herself, to reclaim her voice and her career, but that window was closing rapidly. Every day of continued drug use was doing permanent damage to her voice and her body. The intervention at Mar-a-Lago represented what might be her last chance to make a different choice. Despite the resources being offered and the obvious sincerity of the people confronting her, Whitney Houston ultimately refused to accept the help that Trump, Perelman, and Love were offering. The exact reasons for her refusal were complex and probably not fully understood even by Whitney herself. Part of it was denial. Whitney genuinely believed that she had her drug use under control and that everyone was overreacting. Part of it was pride. Accepting help from Trump and Perelman might have felt like admitting defeat or owing debts to powerful men. Part of it was fear, the prospect of actually dealing with her addiction, and the underlying pain that drove it was more terrifying than continuing to use. And part of it was the toxic influence of the people in Whitney's life who benefited from her continued dysfunction. People who whispered in her ear that Trump and his friends were trying to control her, that they didn't really understand her, that she should trust her real friends who would never judge her. These enablers had a financial stake in keeping Whitney working and generating income regardless of the cost to her health, and they fought hard against the intervention's message. As the intervention concluded without achieving its primary goal of getting Whitney into treatment, the atmosphere at Mar-a-Lago shifted from hopeful determination to frustrated sadness. Trump, Perelman, and Love had given their best effort, had offered resources and support that most people struggling with addiction could never access, and Whitney had still said no. Trump was particularly affected by the failure, having invested significant time and emotional energy into trying to save someone he genuinely admired. In the days following the intervention, Trump spoke with Perelman and Love about what else might be done, whether there were other approaches they could try. But the reality was that Whitney had to want help before anyone could actually help her. You couldn't force sobriety on someone who wasn't ready to accept it, no matter how many resources you threw at the problem. The intervention at Mar-a-Lago became a painful memory for everyone involved, a reminder of the limits of even the best intentions and most generous offers when confronting the demon of addiction. In the years following the failed Mar-a-Lago intervention, Donald Trump carried the weight of that experience largely in private. Unlike many aspects of his life that he publicized extensively, Trump never spoke publicly about his attempt to help Whitney Houston during the 2000s. This silence was unusual for someone who typically had no problem discussing his accomplishments and his connections to famous people. The reason for Trump's discretion was multifaceted. Partly, it was respect for Whitney's privacy and a recognition that revealing the intervention attempt might embarrass her or make her situation worse. Partly, it was Trump's own disappointment and sense of failure. He had assembled resources and people to save Whitney, and it hadn't worked. There was no publicity benefit in advertising a failure, especially one that might make him look powerless or naive. But mostly, Trump's silence about the intervention reflected a genuine sadness about Whitney's trajectory and a hope that she might still turn things around without her private struggles being made more public. Trump continued to follow Whitney's career and personal life from a distance throughout the mid-2000s. The news was rarely good. Whitney and Bobby Brown's marriage continued to be a tabloid spectacle of arrests, bizarre behavior, and obvious dysfunction. Whitney's attempts to perform became increasingly rare and increasingly painful to watch when they did happen. The divorce from Bobby in 2007 offered a brief glimmer of hope that perhaps Whitney might use her freedom to finally address her addiction seriously. There were reports of Whitney entering rehab and committing to sobriety. She released a new album in 2009 that received mixed reviews, but at least showed she was trying to rebuild her career. Trump watched these developments with cautious optimism, hoping that perhaps Whitney had finally reached a point where she was ready to accept help, even if it hadn't been his help. Maybe the failed Mar-a-Lago intervention had planted seeds that were only now beginning to grow. Maybe Whitney's journey to recovery would just take longer than Trump and the others had hoped. The call came on a Saturday afternoon, and even though Donald Trump had been expecting something like this for years, the actual news still hit him like a physical blow. Whitney Houston had been found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles. She was 48 years old. The official cause of death would later be determined as drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. The greatest voice of a generation, the woman whose talent had moved Trump to tears the first time he heard her sing at Trump Plaza more than 20 years earlier, was gone. Trump's first reaction was a complicated mixture of grief, anger, and guilt. Grief for the loss of someone he had genuinely liked and admired. Anger at the people who had enabled Whitney's addiction and pushed back against intervention attempts. And guilt over whether he could have done more, whether there was some other approach he should have tried after the Mar-a-Lago intervention failed. In the immediate aftermath of Whitney's death, Trump was contacted by multiple media outlets requesting his reaction and comments. Trump had developed a reputation for being willing to comment on almost anything, but in this case, he approached the interviews with unusual care. He wanted to honor Whitney's memory and express his genuine sadness at her death, but he also felt that pretending everything had been fine would be dishonest and disrespectful to Whitney's real struggle. Trump called Whitney a friend and emphasized that she had possessed the greatest voice he had ever heard. He acknowledged that her death was a tragedy that had been building for years, and he specifically blamed Bobby Brown and others in Whitney's circle for failing to protect her. These comments were seen by some as inappropriately harsh so soon after Whitney's death, but Trump felt that honest assessment was more respectful than empty platitudes. What Trump notably did not mention in these interviews was his own intervention attempt at Mar-a-Lago. That secret remained buried, known only to the few people who had been directly involved. The years between Whitney's death in 2012 and Mike Love's revelation in 2018 were difficult ones for Trump in terms of processing his failed attempt to save Whitney. Trump was not someone who accepted failure easily or dwelt on things he couldn't change, but the Whitney situation haunted him in ways that other disappointments didn't. He had assembled significant resources, had brought together credible people, had offered help that most addiction sufferers would never have access to, and it hadn't been enough. Whitney had still died, had still destroyed her voice and her career before her death, and Trump couldn't escape the question of whether there was something else he should have tried. Did his approach at Mar-a-Lago push Whitney away rather than help her? Should he have involved different people or tried a different strategy? Would Whitney still be alive if he had just found the right words or the right moment? Trump's silence about the intervention attempt during these years was maintained even as he became increasingly prominent in American public life. His reality television career reached its peak with The Apprentice and its various spin-offs. He flirted with running for president multiple times before finally committing to a campaign in 2015. Throughout this rising political profile, Trump continued to be asked occasionally about Whitney Houston and would repeat his assessment that she had been incredibly talented and her death had been a preventable tragedy. But he never mentioned Mar-a-Lago or Ron Perelman or the specific intervention attempt. This discretion was unusual enough that it underscored how genuinely painful the failure had been for Trump. In a life where Trump publicized nearly everything, his determination to keep the intervention secret suggested that it represented something more personal and more difficult than the business victories and celebrity connections he normally enjoyed discussing. Ron Perelman and Mike Love also maintained their silence about the Mar-a-Lago intervention during the years after Whitney's death. Perelman, who was intensely private about most aspects of his personal life despite his massive wealth and business prominence, never discussed his role in trying to help Whitney. Love, who was more public-facing as an active musician, occasionally spoke about addiction in the music industry and friends he had lost, but he never specifically mentioned Whitney or the intervention attempt. This collective silence among everyone involved suggested that they had reached an understanding, either explicit or implicit, that Whitney's struggle and their failed attempt to help her would remain private. It was only years later, in a very specific and unexpected context, that the secret would finally become public in a way that none of them had anticipated or necessarily wanted. October 11th, 2018. The East Room of the White House was filled with music industry professionals, legislators, and artists gathered for a signing ceremony for the Music Modernization Act. President Donald Trump was scheduled to sign the bipartisan legislation that would reform music licensing and ensure that artists received fair compensation in the digital age. Mike Love of the Beach Boys was among those invited to speak at the ceremony, and as he approached the microphone, no one in the room anticipated that he was about to reveal a secret that had been kept for nearly 2 decades. Love began his remarks by praising Trump's long-standing support for American music and musicians, noting that Trump's relationship with the music industry went back decades before his political career. Then Love said something that caused reporters in the room to immediately start taking notes and Trump himself to react with visible surprise. Love looked directly at Trump and said, "People can say what they want, but you've always been a big supporter of some of the best music America's ever made. I was there with you at Mar-a-Lago when you brought Ron Perelman, and you tried your best to help get Whitney Houston in some kind of shape." Revelation hung in the air for a moment as its significance registered with everyone present. Mike Love had just casually mentioned a previously unknown intervention attempt involving the President of the United States, one of America's wealthiest businessmen, and one of the most famous singers in history. Trump's reaction to Love's unexpected disclosure was carefully controlled, but clearly caught off guard. He nodded slowly and smiled slightly, neither confirming nor denying the specifics, but not contradicting Love's account either. The moment lasted only seconds before the ceremony moved on to other topics, but those few sentences had opened a door into a previously hidden chapter of Trump's relationship with Whitney Houston. Within hours, media outlets around the world were reporting on Love's revelation and trying to piece together what had actually happened at that intervention and why Trump had never mentioned it during the 6 years between Whitney's death and Love's public comments. In the days following Mike Love's White House revelation, reporters pressed for more details about the Mar-a-Lago intervention. How exactly had Whitney ended up there? What specifically was said during the intervention? Why had Trump kept it secret for so long? Why was Love revealing it now? The answers to these questions remained frustratingly incomplete. Trump himself declined to elaborate significantly beyond acknowledging that, yes, he had tried to help Whitney Houston during her struggles with addiction, and no, it hadn't been successful. Ron Perelman, true to his typically private nature, made no public comment about his involvement. Mike Love gave a few additional interviews where he expressed surprise at the attention his comments had generated, insisting he had simply been trying to praise Trump's support for musicians and hadn't meant to create a major news story. The lack of detailed information allowed the revelation to become something of a Rorschach test where people's interpretations depended heavily on their existing views of Trump. For Trump's supporters, the revelation was evidence of a compassionate side that contradicted the harsh caricature often presented by his critics. Here was proof that Trump had quietly tried to use his resources and influence to help someone in need without seeking publicity or credit. The fact that he had kept the intervention private, even after Whitney's death, and even during years of intense media scrutiny, showed a capacity for discretion and respect for others' privacy that contradicted claims that Trump only cared about himself and his image. For Trump's critics, however, the revelation raised uncomfortable questions about whether the intervention had been genuine compassion or another example of Trump's need to insert himself into high-profile situations. Some questioned whether bringing Ron Perelman and Mike Love to confront Whitney at Mar-a-Lago might have been more about Trump demonstrating his power and connections than about actually helping Whitney in the most effective way possible. The debate over Trump's motivations and the intervention's nature reflected the broader polarization of American political and cultural life in 2018. Even after Mike Love's revelation and subsequent media investigation, significant gaps remain in our understanding of what exactly happened at the Mar-a-Lago intervention. We don't know precisely when it occurred, though it was clearly sometime in the early to mid-2000s when Whitney's addiction was spiraling out of control, but before her 2007 divorce from Bobby Brown. We don't know exactly how Whitney was convinced to come to Mar-a-Lago, or whether she had any advance warning that an intervention was being planned. We don't know the specific details of what was said during the intervention, or how Whitney responded beyond the fact that she ultimately declined to enter treatment at that time. We don't know whether Trump made additional attempts to help Whitney after the Mar-a-Lago intervention failed, or whether that represented his last direct effort to intervene in her addiction. These unanswered questions are likely to remain unanswered, as the key participants have shown little interest in providing additional details about what was clearly a painful and difficult experience for everyone involved. What we do know is that Donald Trump's attempt to help Whitney Houston represents a side of his personality and his approach to relationships that doesn't always fit neatly into the public narratives about him. Trump is often portrayed as someone motivated primarily by money, fame, and ego, someone who views other people as tools to be used for his own advancement. The Mar-a-Lago intervention complicates that narrative because it involved Trump expending significant effort and resources to help someone who could do nothing for him professionally or politically. Whitney Houston in the 2000s was a fading star whose best years were behind her and who represented more liability than opportunity for anyone associated with her. Trump's decision to try to help her anyway suggests motivations beyond simple self-interest. Whether those motivations were genuine compassion for a troubled friend or something more complex and self-serving remains open to interpretation. But the fact of the intervention attempt itself is significant regardless of how we judge Trump's underlying motives. The most painful question raised by the revelation of the Mar-a-Lago intervention is whether Whitney Houston could have been saved if things had gone differently that day. If Whitney had accepted Trump and Perelman's offer of comprehensive treatment, if she had entered a top-tier addiction facility and committed to recovery, might she still be alive today? Addiction experts caution against such simple counterfactuals, noting that recovery from severe substance abuse disorder requires not just one intervention or treatment episode, but sustained commitment over years and sometimes decades. Even if Whitney had entered treatment after the Mar-a-Lago intervention, there's no guarantee she would have maintained sobriety or avoided the eventual fatal relapse that killed her in 2012. Addiction is a chronic disease with high relapse rates even among people who receive the best possible care and support. Whitney's addiction was complicated by trauma, by the unique pressures of her level of fame, by a toxic marriage, and by an industry that enabled dysfunction as long as it remained profitable. That said, it's impossible not to wonder whether earlier intervention might have given Whitney additional years of life, and possibly a chance to repair some of the damage to her voice and career. By the time Whitney died in 2012, she had been struggling with addiction for more than a decade. The cumulative effect of years of cocaine use had taken a toll on her heart, her lungs, and her voice that might have been irreversible even if she had achieved sustained sobriety. But if the Mar-a-Lago intervention had succeeded in getting Whitney into treatment in the early 2000s, she would have had more years of potential recovery ahead of her and less accumulated damage to her body and her talent. The intervention represented a moment of possibility, a branching point where Whitney's life might have taken a different path. That she chose not to take that path, that she resisted the help being offered, doesn't diminish the significance of Trump and the others having tried. Sometimes saving someone isn't possible, no matter how many resources you marshal or how sincere your efforts. Sometimes the person you're trying to save isn't ready to be saved. The story of Donald Trump's secret intervention attempt at Mar-a-Lago adds a layer of complexity to how we understand both Trump and Whitney Houston. For Trump, it reveals a capacity for private compassion and a willingness to try to help even when there was no obvious benefit to himself. It shows him recognizing someone else's extraordinary talent and feeling genuine sadness about watching that talent destroyed by addiction. At the same time, the intervention's failure and Trump's subsequent silence about it reveal something about his discomfort with failure and his tendency to publicize successes while burying disappointments. Trump only acknowledged the intervention after Mike Love forced the issue by mentioning it publicly, suggesting that Trump might have preferred for it to remain forever private rather than become part of his public story. For Whitney Houston, the revelation of the Mar-a-Lago intervention adds to our understanding of how many people tried to help her and how resistant she was to accepting that help. It wasn't just her family pleading with her to get clean. It was billionaires and presidents and industry legends. And still, the addiction was stronger. In the end, The Mar-a-Lago intervention represents both the best impulses of people trying to save a friend and the tragic limits of intervention when addiction has its hooks deep in someone. Trump, Perelman, and Love assembled resources that most people struggling with addiction could only dream of: access to the best treatment facilities, financial support, powerful connections, genuine concern from accomplished people. They offered all of this to Whitney Houston, and she said no. That refusal wasn't necessarily a failure of the intervention's design or execution. It was simply the reality of addiction's power and the truth that ultimately every person has to make their own choice about whether to fight for recovery. Whitney's choice in that moment at Mar-a-Lago was to continue using, to reject help, to hold on to the familiar pain of addiction rather than face the terrifying uncertainty of recovery. And that choice, repeated in countless moments over the following years, led inevitably to a bathtub in Beverly Hills on February 11, 2012. The intervention that nobody knew about until 6 years after Whitney's death reminds us that behind every addiction tragedy are multiple stories of people trying to help and failing, of moments where different choices might have led to different outcomes, of the complicated web of good intentions and harsh realities that characterize this disease. Donald Trump's secret mission to save Whitney Houston failed, but the attempt itself reveals something important about both of them and about the limits of even the most well-resourced efforts to rescue someone from themselves.